Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. As you know, I'm starting a new series on the sole subject of the secrets of Britain. And there are many of them, I have to tell you. The secret history, the forgotten history. I'm going to talk to you today about the modern history of Britain very much. You have to understand that the modern world is, to a very large extent, the result of what happened in Britain in the last 300 years. Now, you might think that that's a bit strange to say that. What about the United States? What about the rest of Europe? What about China? But the actual culture that we live within, the cultural norms, are very much the result of certain things that took place in Britain from, I would say, the time of the Tudors onwards, and which in a way culminated with the First World War. But I'll come to that in a little while. But before I go into that, I want to read out to you the famous John of Gaunt speech from Richard II, when John of Gaunt was the Duke of York, and he was fulminating about the wonders of Britain as this island. He knew that the king, Richard II, was coming to disinherit and take his lands from him and disinherit his son. And it was a last cry, and shortly afterwards he dies in the play. A very moving speech. You've probably heard it before. I'm going to read it again, and then I'm going to talk to you about certain things that mark out this island as special in the modern age, because most of this series I'm going to go into the ancient history, even before the Romans came, and later on, after the Romans left, the King Arthur tradition and what that's really all about. We'll be talking about that. But I want you to see what happened in Britain from the Tudor times onwards, and we'll go into that. Shakespeare, of course, was alive at the time of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, who was the last of the Tudors. Now, here's John of Gaunt's speech. Methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. He tires betimes, that spurs too fast betimes. With eager feeding food doth choke the feeder. Light vanity, insatiable cormorant, consuming means soon preys upon itself. So he's referring here to Richard II, who's doing all sorts of unlawful things and about to steal from his estate that should have passed on to his son. So it's just a sort of lamentation that we're getting, and that's the prologue, you could say, to his main speech, which I'm going to go into now. This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of Moor, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service and true chivalry, as is the sepulchre, is stubborn jury, of the world's ransom, blessed Mary's Son. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm, England bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life! How happy then were my ensuing death. Now, these words, of course, of John of Gaunt in Richard II, they are presaging, in a way, what's going to happen with the uprising against Richard and how that's going to precipitate a whole series of conflicts that are going to rack England apart with the Wars of the Roses and the destruction of so many people and places and, so much. He's lamenting that England's falling in upon itself. And of course, Shakespeare knew this because he's writing retrospectively, so he can put these prophecies into the mouth of John of Gaunt. But I want to contrast that with our own times, because we see around us now a denigration of not just Britain, but the whole Western world, the whole woke nonsense that's been going out, the whole treatment of the peoples of these lands as if they don't matter, the whole recalibrating of our culture and denigration of it. John of Gaunt would recognise that, and he would see that as a similar kind of event. So I want to here document the achievements that Britain made over this period from the Tudors onwards and how it shaped our modern society as we know it, our modern civilization. And then when we've done that, in the next programs, I'm going to reveal to you and take you on a journey into some of the deepest mysteries, deepest esoteric mysteries to do with this land. Because you see, I'm the co-author of this book, which some of you I know are familiar with, and we've been talking about the death of Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett this year, who were my co-authors. I wrote the book, actually, but it was based on their work, and I submitted the manuscript to them for correction. And they made one or two small corrections, but not a lot. So I think I can say that I'm someone who understands their work pretty well to have worked with them on this. I don't agree with everything they say, I have to say, but I put it across their ideas, not mine, as much as I could in this book. And I've done other books since then which have gone into other mysteries which I think are very important. The New Jerusalem, and I'll be talking a lot about the idea, it's a very ancient idea actually, that Britain is the lost Israel. And I'll talk to you about that. Some of you may have heard of that. Well, you might think, well, that's crazy, it's nonsense. We'll be discussing that in later programs. And I've also written a whole book on the Stone of Destiny, which you may be surprised to learn gives you the dimensions of how to build a pyramid. But I'll tell you all about that in a later lecture. Today I want to talk about these achievements since the time of Shakespeare. So I've categorised these, and I'm going to read out what I've written here. So the first I would call legal. England already had a parliament in Shakespeare's time, though this was not as democratic as today. It constrained monarchs from becoming tyrants by controlling taxation. That's very important. Whoever controls the purse strings actually controls policy. And Parliament learnt that a long time ago, even back in the time of Edward I and King John. If you can control how the monarch can raise taxes and how much he can spend, you have got a good control over his overweening, his desire. All monarchs have this desire to become total dictators, and the way you stop that is you have a balancing force, which is the Parliament and the law courts. Tensions between king and Parliament came to a head in 1643 at the time of Charles I. He believed he had a divine right to rule as he pleased. Yeah, well, as I was saying, kings have that tendency. Parliament constrained his ambitions. This led to revolution, a bloody civil war, and the public beheading of Charles in 1649. This is all to do with the Cavaliers and Roundheads. The Cavaliers being the king's men, the Roundheads, the parliamentarians, particularly from the cities, particularly London, Bristol. For 10 years, Oliver Cromwell, who was the general of the parliamentarian forces, he was also a member of Parliament earlier than that, ruled as Lord Protector. He was offered the crown, actually, but he turned it down. He said, I don't want to do that. I'll be Lord Protector, which made him effectively the tyrant of England, and that was not a good thing either. After he died, the people were weary of dictatorship and invited back Charles II as king. Charles II was the son of the beheaded Charles I. Both of them were Stuart kings. His was a precarious reign for a lot of the time, as he tried to rule without calling Parliament. So he knew about this whole thing that he needs to call Parliament if he wants more money. So he tried to get by borrowing money from across in France, Louis XIV, but also by charging taxes on things like windows or ship loads and things like this. He had certain dodges, wheezes you would call them, but that wasn't very popular at all. But he managed to get through his reign reasonably peacefully, and he died in his bed, converting to Catholicism in his deathbed. Probably he was already, but he wasn't letting on about that. That was very important, as we'll come to shortly. His brother James II took the throne, that was in 1685, intent on opening the wounds of religion. He tried to make England Catholic once more and was deposed. You have to understand that since the time of Henry VIII, England had been a Protestant country, except for a short 10-year period during the reign of Mary I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII, one of the daughters, and she persecuted the Protestants, as the Protestants had earlier persecuted the Catholics. And then when she died and Elizabeth I came on the throne, again the Protestants were in the ascendancy, and you had things like priests being brutally murdered for treason, and meant they were hanged, drawn and quartered. And that was largely a political thing. I don't think Elizabeth herself really wanted to do that. She was actually quite moderate. She would actually like to live and let live, but she was very threatened by conspiracies, and particularly Spain, the Catholic power, under Philip II, who had actually been married to Mary before that. Philip wanted to take over England and make it Catholic again. And Spain at that time was very rich. It was the most powerful country in Europe at the time. So you've heard about the Spanish Armada in 1588. And Elizabeth, her position was precarious, and she had to watch everything. So she had to be very stern. And I think that created at least the situation where these priests were being put to death. I have very mixed feelings about that, because I was myself brought up as a Catholic. So you can understand that. But I do understand it was a political thing much more than a religious thing on her part. So anyway, James II took the throne intent on opening the wound of religion. He tried to make England Catholic once more and was deposed. In his stead, his daughter and son-in-law, William of Orange, were crowned as joint monarchs. Orange was in the Netherlands, so he was a Dutch king who came over with his wife Mary, and they were jointly crowned. They were required to sign the Bill of Rights of 1689. Now, I have to... people say we have no rights in this country. We have no... like America does, their Charter of Independence and their Bill of Rights. Well, we do actually have a Bill of Rights, 1689, and it requires that the king has to obey the law, he has to rule with Parliament, and he has to uphold the Protestant religion, and some other things like that. And it effectively took the power away from the king and put it much more firmly into the hands of the people represented by Parliament. And so that's where we begin to get this situation of having a figurehead monarch, as the monarchy in Britain is generally regarded. And that's not a bad thing at all. It means that we separate the pomp and splendour and the riding around in golden coaches and the living in palaces and all that from the day-to-day governance of the country. And that's not a bad thing at all. And it's worked out well for us in the long term. How long it will carry on working out well, I don't know. But I think that's something that the Americans particularly, I think they miss. But I won't go down that path. It's something that we cherish anyway in Britain. During the 19th, I'll have to finish this bit. They were required to sign the Bill of Rights of 1689. This enshrined in law the duty of the sovereign towards the people, the rights of Parliament, and his duty to uphold the Church of England as the national religion. All our kings and queens have had to swear to this ever since. So when they get their coronation, they have to swear that they will do these things. During the 19th and 20th centuries, there were various reform acts of Parliament, eventually extending the democratic franchise to all men and women over 18 years of age. So that was a steady process as well. Thus, Great Britain went through its revolutionary period over a century before the American Revolution of 1776 or the French Revolution of 1789. So people tend to think of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, they're the standard bearers for the people against the king. And we went through all that. And we had our period of revolution, we had our bloody terror, we had all of that. We, chopped off the head of the king, we did that. And we went through the tyranny of Oliver Cromwell. Not always bad, but he was he was a Puritan, so he did all things like closing all the pubs and closing the theatres, and that doesn't really fit with the British temperament. So we were glad to see the end of him and the return of our merry monarch, Charles II. So, thus Great Britain went through its revolutionary period over a century before the American Revolution of 1776 or the French Revolution of 1789. However, unlike those countries, we preserve our restored monarchy as a precious legacy and symbol. So people sometimes wonder, why do you still have a monarch? Why don't you have a president? Well, we actually do like this continuity that it gives us. And you saw that with the burial of our last queen, Queen Elizabeth II, and all that went into that, the majesty and the nation. She represented the mother of the nation. And we're like burying our own mother, And then when Charles was going to become the king, the trumpeters blowing the trumpets, it links us back to our ancient history. and gives us a sense of continuity, that whatever happens in the modern world, whatever travails we're going through, there is a continuous flow, there is a continuity of our country and its meaning that we can relate to in our time, knowing that is a very ancient thing, that we're echoing what would have been done centuries ago. And for us, we like that. Now then, the second heading I have here is foreign policy. For the past 300 years, and even before this, Britain's foreign policy has been one of maintaining the balance of power. You may have, if you've been to school in Britain, you would have heard about the balance of power. This has led us into conflict with pretty much all of the larger countries of Europe at one time or another. First off was Spain with the Spanish Armada, and later wars to secure the Netherlands against Spanish domination and rule. So the Netherlands had come to Spain, I think, through marriage, and they were Dutch. The Dutch were Protestants in the main, and yet they were being put under the Spanish Catholic rule, and they rebelled against that, and it went on, for centuries. Britain stood by the Dutch and helped them at various times, and we had sent armies over there. Sir Philip Sidney died in the Netherlands, the Battle of Zutphen, for example. He was our great poet and darling of the nation, and there he shed his blood in the fields in the Netherlands, trying to stop the Spanish hanging on to this Protestant country. So that was the first big conflict. In the 18th century, there were various wars against France. Well, we've had plenty of wars against France before that, but some they won, some we won. But in the 18th century, against France, notably over the Spanish succession and in competition for North America. So the wars of the Spanish succession, the Battle of Blenheim, the Battle of Oudenarde, Malplaquet, Ramillies, these were fought by the Duke of Marlborough, who was actually an ancestor, I think, of Diana Spencer and certainly of Winston Churchill. So the Duke of Marlborough, he was made a duke after that period, and he was given Blenheim Palace. So he was one of our great heroes, but he did it in conjunction with an alliance with the Prussians, I think with the Austrians as well. I might be wrong on that, but certainly the Dutch and ourselves. So this was typical of Britain acting in European politics to keep the balance of power. We didn't want to build an empire in Europe, but we wanted to make sure that everything was kept in balance. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there were the Napoleonic Wars. Well, the French Revolution led to immediate wars with virtually all France's neighbours. And when Napoleon came along, he defeated Austria, he defeated Prussia, he defeated everyone, and built this huge French empire on continental Europe. But he couldn't get to Britain because, the sea's in the way, and we had the more powerful navy. Defeated his navy at the Battle of Trafalgar and other battles. So, again, Britain restored the balance of power in Europe in alliance with others. And finally, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated, and Europe began to take more the shape it does today. So allied with Russia, Spain and Portugal, and at times also with Austria and Prussia, Britain's avowed purpose was to stop France taking over the whole of Europe as Napoleon's empire. In the late 19th century, Britain supported the unification of Italy, but was more ambivalent about the unification of Germany, seeing this as a threat to the balance of power. So that was the power politics of the 19th century. Almost as an afterthought, the British Empire, nearly all of it outside of Europe, grew at least in terms of population, to become the largest in the entire history of the world. So we say this about the British Empire. It wasn't done deliberately, it just happened as a byproduct of setting up trading posts mainly, and trading with various nations and getting involved in local politics, for example, in India, stopping. They'd had wars going on in India for centuries, and Britain got drawn into largely as peacemaker, and taking over control of India actually brought an end to the warfare there. During the 100 years of the Pax Britannica, Britain became extremely rich. Yeah, well, we're a trading nation of shopkeepers, Napoleon called us. So too did many of the countries that made up the empire, if only in comparison to how they had been prior to joining the empire. The British introduced the rule of law as more than just a concept. Thus there were meaningful law courts where justice could be sought. This is very important in many countries where the law depended on how much bribe you paid to the judge. The British had this standard that it didn't matter who you were, you could come up and you'd be judged according to the law. That was certainly true in the 19th century. Not so much now, maybe. I don't know. I hope it's still true. But anyway, there was much more law introduced into these different countries. Peace was maintained, especially on high seas, where piracy had previously been rife. Now you have to understand that high seas, we take it for granted that you can take a ship and go anywhere you like, and it will be peaceful. No one's going to attack you at sea. But that's not always been the case, and it was not the case before the British Empire started enforcing the rule of law on the high seas and rooting out pirates. There were, for example, the Barbary pirates who came from North Africa were a real menace in the Mediterranean. If you were trying to sail your ship with your goods to trade somewhere else, and the Barbary pirates caught you, not only would they steal your cargo and your ship, but they would take you yourself as slave and sell you in the slave markets of North Africa. And that happened not just to Europeans, it happened to Americans who found themselves unfortunate enough to have been caught up in the parts of the Mediterranean where the Barbary pirates were operating. And they find themselves, there were tales about this, people being dragged off and having to walk through the desert for miles drinking camel's urine because there's nothing else to drink. Horrible stories. And of course, if you're a woman, you're going to be sold into a harem somewhere to become someone else's plaything. So this was awful. And the Barbary pirates used to sail up the coast of France. They'd sail up to Britain. They'd take people off the coast of South Wales and Cornwall, particularly, on an island. So these were real menace, and the Royal Navy, as late as the 18th century, were rooting out these people. And in the 19th century, they were still around, and they eventually were defeated and dealt with. Meanwhile, Christian missionaries went out, even into the darkest regions of Africa. They not only taught the teachings of Jesus Christ, but built schools and hospitals too. In this way, the lives of the people were immeasurably improved with better hygiene, diet, and education. In the 20th century, Britain was allied with France and Russia against Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire in the Great War. That's the First World War. This war led to the collapse of various empires and royal houses. Somehow, with help from the USA, the British Empire survived, even growing in size to its zenith, and I'll be talking about that in later lectures. The Second World War was different. It bankrupted Britain and led to the hasty dismantling of the empire. I would say over-hasty. There was too much of a rush to pull it all apart, and that led to a lot of problems in the last century. Great Britain, though still a middling power, handed over the baton of maintaining the balance of power to the USA. So you could say after the Second World War, Britain pulled out. The final nail in the coffin of the British Empire was really the Suez Crisis of 1956, which I remember well because it started on my birthday, my 7th birthday. And after that, Britain withdrew from east of Suez completely and went into a whole decades of decline with constant strikes, strife, the collapse really of what was left. However, it maintained the monarchy, and the countries that emerged from the empire nearly all joined the British Commonwealth. So there is still, now called simply the Commonwealth, this is a sort of ghostly after-image of the old empire. So then, Britain passed on the baton to America, which imposed the Pax Americana. They took over the role of policing the seas, which the Royal Navy had done before that. The Royal Navy shrank. We didn't have an empire anymore. We didn't have the wealth to support a big navy anymore, or a big army. And we sort of pulled back to become this little island nation that we are now of Britain. And that happens to all empires in the end, doesn't it? But I think there's still more to come. I'll talk about that in a later lecture. Now I want to move on to another subject, which is science. What we today call science owes its origins to the Italian Renaissance, being known as natural philosophy. The epicenter was the Florentine Academy, founded by Cosimo Medici, or de' Medici. A major step forward was the publication in 1534 of De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium by Nikolai Copernicus, a Polish monk, so concerning the orbits, the revolutions of the orbits of the heavens. This book, which proposed that the sun and not the earth lay at the centre of the universe, caused a furore. A major proponent of this theory was Giordano Bruno, a former Dominican friar from Italy, who lectured widely on this and other subjects deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. Now, of course, he grew up near Naples, and he was a Dominican friar, so he's a Catholic himself. But he moved away. He gave up his robe, is that what you would call it, with a monk or friar, and he took on this whole new science. You would call him maybe the first proselytizer for science, going to France, going to Britain, going to Germany, and to Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, we should call it, giving lectures and trying to get people interested in this New Age thought, New Age for them. But the philosopher who was really behind the whole movement was British, but we'll talk about him shortly. He was burnt at the stake in Rome in February 1600, for being a heretic. You're not allowed to say that. Galileo Galilei, the most famous scientist of his day, Galileo, who said to have invented the telescope and looked at the moon and noticed that it had craters, looked at the Jupiter and discovered it had 4 moons. He was declared a heretic, even though he'd been up the tower and dropping, things to find out if they accelerated at the same rate. Galileo was a great scientist, but that didn't protect him. He was tried for heresy in 1633 by the Roman Inquisition. His crime was saying that the earth goes round the sun. It said that he was forced to repent. You say, no, it doesn't go around the sun. He didn't want to go the same way as Bruno had. But they say that under his breath he muttered, "But still it turns," something like that. He knew damn well that that was not true. It was the Earth goes around the sun. He fared better than Bruno, being kept under house arrest till his death in 1642. So that's that was the approach of the old world, the Catholic world, the Italian world of Rome at the time. It was very different in the north. By contrast, Protestant England was much more favourable to scientific thought. In the 1640s, just about the same time as Galileo was dying, the Invisible College started holding regular meetings at Gresham College in London. Now, I've done lectures on this before, so I'm not going to go into that in detail. I have written a book. Have I got it here? I think I have. Yes. This one. I am planning to republish some of these books. The New Jerusalem, how in the 1600s, after this period, they wanted to rebuild London as a New Jerusalem. But this was, the Invisible College was meeting at Gresham College in London, which was set up ostensibly to teach the people of London basic skills like rhetoric and mathematics and astronomy. So to make a more educated citizenry in London, which would be good for trade. And this was done by the bequest of Sir Thomas Gresham, who had set up the Royal Exchange in London, and he left his house to become a college, Gresham College. And there were professors there, and they started meeting together, and they founded this institution. They called it at first the Invisible College because it could move around. They sometimes held meetings in Oxford. And during the 1640s, of course, is when we were having our civil war. But they had a rule that you leave your politics, your religion, outside. In the college itself, you only discuss science. And that was a good rule. And even people like Oliver Cromwell were favourable towards the Invisible College. Some of the people who attended were his friends. Also, there were royalists who were attending. So they left their religion aside and they focused on science. In 1661, following the restoration of Charles II, that's the Invisible College, was granted a royal charter as the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. This was later shortened to the Royal Society. Its journal, the first ever, became required reading for all scientists. Yeah, the Royal Society is still going on right now. It's highly prestigious, and it still has its journal. To be published in its journal is highly prestigious if you're a scientist. And to become a fellow of the Royal Society, you have the letters FRS after your name, is still considered the highest accolade in science. So this all began in London, in the 1640s. And Britain itself produced many of the most famous scientists of all time, including Sir Christopher Wren. He not only rebuilt the churches of London after the Great Fire of 1666 and built the new St. Paul's Cathedral, who was the architect, but he did a lot of other things too. And he was very, very interested in astronomy. He was a professor of astronomy at one point, very into mathematics. He was a great scientist in his own right and one of the founding members of the Invisible College and later in the Royal Society. There was Robert Hooke, Hooke's Law you've probably heard of. Robert Boyle, he had all his Boyle's laws of gases and so on. Henry Cavendish, Humphrey Davy, the Davy lamp and all that. So, and of course Sir Isaac Newton. He's a later generation than the earlier Invisible College people, but he was the greatest scientist, I think, of all time. Newton's laws and what Newton discovered in his Principia Mathematica and all of these things. great scientists, and they were able to flourish because they were in Britain, which was not covered by the threat of being dragged up before the Inquisition and having your head chopped off if you said the Earth went round the sun. So that's one of Britain's great achievements. And Britain was also the centre of cultural revolutions brought about by the advancement of scientific learning. The seed drill was invented by Jethro Tull in 1701. It brought about the agricultural revolution. So you have a machine that can drop seeds exactly in the right position in a field. Instead of someone out throwing grain by hand from a basket, you have a machine that's doing it very accurately. And you can grow your crops much more efficiently that way. And that led to the agricultural revolution. You didn't need so many workers on the land. Initially, that's difficult for them, but they moved to the cities and took part in the next revolution. The invention of the roller spinning machinery in the 1740s led to the establishment of the first cotton mills. So you had these spinning jennies that were not hand spun, they were done by machines. And then you could have whole racks of these making cotton, then weaving machines, all powered at first by water power and later on by steam power, as we come to. Railways is another British invention. They made their first appearance at Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales in 1804. So that's during the Napoleonic War. That's when the first steam engine on rails started pulling trucks to move coal from one place to another. This engine, built by Richard Trevithick, he was from Cornwall, by the way, and Cornwall had rocking steam engines for pumping out water from the Cornish tin mines. Before that, he then used he made use of high-pressure steam technology developed by James Watt. So that the first steam engines didn't use high-pressure steam. They just used the difference in pressure caused by when you condense steam to make it water. You get a vacuum. And that gives you some power, but using high-pressure steam gave far more power, and they were able to use that for steam engines. Made it possible for the first time to move faster than the galloping horse. So you have to understand, before the invention of the steam engine on railway tracks, you couldn't move faster than the speed of a galloping horse. That had been true right through history. This was a major change. Suddenly you can get on a train in London and you could be in Glasgow within the day, less than that time. So that revolutionized the whole world. Railways using steam engines for traction made it possible for the first time to move faster than the galloping horse. Very soon, railway lines were being built all over Britain, throughout the empire and across the world. Britain was able to export this technology, export lines, export steam engines and carriages and all of that. That all added to the prosperity when building railways in Africa and India and other places. Very big achievement. And of course, very soon people were building railway lines in America, in Russia, and in other places too. There are many other areas of research where British scientists and technicians led the world. Among these were the first telegram system. That was between London and India. It's not much help to you if you can't get a message except by sea, and it takes weeks for a boat to take a message from India to London or vice versa. Using telegram system, they could send various relay stations all along the way. They could extend messages and they would be there within an hour or two. So that was a big achievement and meant that you could react. And the empire started to become much more joined up than it was prior to that. And of course that technology. We take for granted now that we can go on the internet, we can talk to anyone in the world at any time, in real time. But that's something that you couldn't do in the 19th century. So among these were the first telegram system, the first radio transmission from England to America, the first jet engine, penicillin, the discovery of DNA code, and the first programmable computer, the Colossus, Alan Turing and all of that. Now, before I leave this section, I just want to put in something else. There's been a lot of debate lately about the role of slavery, and it gets said that the British Empire was built on the back of slaves, and it's not true. It was actually built on the back of the steam engine and the Royal Navy. That's what created the British Empire, made it work. It was not slavery. In fact, we're the first to abolish it. So I'm going to read this bit out to you here. In recent years, after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, there have been accusations that the British Empire was built on slavery. Now, of course, there had been individuals who were slavers in the earlier parts of the 18th century, but that was not a policy of the country as a whole. Far from it. It was just individuals profiting from the already existent traffic of slaves across the Atlantic, from Africa to America and to the West Indies. Those slaves were sold to the mariners who were collecting them to transport them by the chieftains. The African chieftains themselves, living on the coast of Africa, were making money out of selling fellow black people. Many of them captured from inland in Africa and dragged off to the coast and put in chains and then sold off to be taken to America as slaves. So there's blame that goes round in all directions with this, and slavery was not invented then anyways. It's gone on throughout human history. And the main reason for it is that if you want to get rich, you need an extra energy source. And they use the energy of the slaves to make things for which they're not going to be paid. That's one way of getting rich, isn't it? But the advance of technology, and particularly the steam engine, made the whole idea of slavery redundant. And the British Empire grew up using the much better power system of steam engines rather than human muscle to do the work. And, we didn't need to be like the Roman Empire with millions of slaves, or the Greek Empire, or the Persian Empire, or the American slave owners of the South. We didn't need to be like that, and we weren't. The movement to abolish slavery began in 1787. That's the official movement. It was already regarded with disdain even before that. When William Wilberforce, a Liberal, and William Pitt, that's Pitt the Younger, who would become a Tory Prime Minister, joined forces to campaign on the issue. The Act that abolished slavery throughout the British Empire was passed in Parliament in 1833. Now, understand that Canada was still part of the empire, so that meant that slavery was abolished in Canada at that time, which meant that slaves who escaped from the USA to Canada were free men. I don't think that's ever mentioned, but it ought to be. That is because Canada was still part of the British Empire under the Crown, that black African people who had, for generations, have been enslaved in the USA became free as long as they got under the Crown, under the British Empire. This was the first such act in the world, for till then slavery was commonplace throughout the world. It still is in Arab countries, still is to this day, and we haven't been able to stop it, and it's growing again. And that's a great shame. That is the shame of everyone, that people trafficking and so on goes on today, much more than it did even a few decades ago. Shocking, but it's true. And that's with a decline, I think, of the West and Western values. Long before this act, during the Napoleonic Wars, so the Napoleonic Wars took place, the French Revolution was 1789, and the Battle of Waterloo, the final chapter, was 1815. So between that time, even then, the Royal Navy was searching ships and freeing slaves. So we come across a French ship or a Spanish ship or Portuguese ship that has slaves on board, we would free them. And sometimes those slaves would choose to join the crew of the Royal Navy. Contrary to what people think, the sailors in the Royal Navy were well fed and looked after because they were needed. They needed them to be in good state. You didn't starve your sailors, you fed them well and looked after them. Yes, it was a strict discipline. There had to be on those ships, but on the whole, the people were well looked after and fed in the Royal Navy. The Navy enforced this on foreign as well as domestic shipping, making it very hard for anyone to take slaves to America during the 19th century. By contrast, slavery was not abolished in the USA until 1865. So that's over 30 years later that you had the abolition of slavery in America after the Civil War. And actually, I think probably because we didn't let slaves be taken to the South, because of our Acts of Parliament, it was one reason why America woke up and to the need to free its own slaves. So I just wanted to cover those few points because I wanted you to see that Britain has had a very big impact on what we might call the modern world, much more than probably any other country in the world. And it's only a small country. It had the largest empire ever. It's only a small country, but and even beyond it, the English language has become the lingua franca of the entire world. There are more people that speak English as their second language than any other. It's the language even of the European Union. If they want to talk among themselves, they use English because everyone knows it. I've been in parts of Scandinavia and Holland and places like that where the people often speak better English than most English people do, better grammatically. So English has become the universal language, as Latin had been in the ancient world, or before that Greek, and probably before that Akkadian or something like that. So that is a legacy of the British Empire, and the American Empire, they don't call it an empire, but it sort of is. That's ultimately goes back to Britain as well, because it was the British people who founded it, and the early revolutionaries were British. So it's something that's still continuing to this day. And something else that's very important, we will talk about this in some depth later on, is that by some curious quirk of fate, it was the British Army which in December 1917 took Jerusalem without firing a single shot. the Turks, who had owned the Ottoman Empire, had controlled the whole of Palestine, as well as places like Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. They withdrew from Jerusalem because they saw aeroplanes flying. The British had a squadron of aircraft, and there was a prophecy: as birds fly, so will be the coming of. I forget the quote. I'll find it for you sometime. But it's a prophecy in the Bible which is interpreted as symbolizing the freeing of Jerusalem by these birds in the air. And the birds, of course, were the aircraft that were used in 1917. And it was a very prophetic time that was done. 30 years later, the British withdrew from the Holy Land. And you had the birth of Israel, the Jewish state. It shouldn't really be called Israel. I think it should be called Judah, because the Jews are only part of ancient Israel. There were 12 tribes. The Jews comprise 2.5 tribes, you could say, tribe of Judah, tribe of Benjamin, and the Levitical priests, or at least some of them. The other 10 tribes disappear from history, and we'll be talking about that and its connections with Christianity. So that's all to come in later lectures. We live in very exciting times, you could say, very frightening times as well. I do believe that we're living through the revelation at the moment. I've done many programs on that, you'll find on my channel. And we're coming up to the climax of all of that. So hang on to your hats, because the winds of change are blowing strongly. Okay, that's all I wanted to say today. And we'll get on to other things, the mysteries of Britain, to do with Stonehenge, to do with the arrival of the Trojans, all sorts of stuff, the Holy Grail. There's plenty of stuff for us to discuss, and we'll be getting into that as this series progresses. So thank you very much for your time. If you aren't subscribed already, please do so. There's also our website, invisiblecollege.uk, and you can go there and you find links to all sorts of programs there. And if you can find it in your heart to help support this channel, I'd love it if you became a patron through patreon.com, Adrian G. Gilbert, patreon.com / Adrian G. Gilbert. I'll put the links in below here, and I look forward to speaking with you again. So, bye-bye.